Final Fantasy has over 60 games, depending on how you like to count them, and that can be intimidating for newcomers to the franchise. Maybe you've seen the announcement for Final Fantasy XVI, but are asking if you actually need to play the other 15 mainline games first. The answer is no. Let's crush that one now. The mainline games do not have a continuous story. However, playing a few of these games would actually help you understand the world of Final Fantasy, its tropes, and why it's one of the best franchises to ever grace the video game world. This is the best Final Fantasy games for beginners. The channel is Bronze Dad Plays, and let's dive in. Number 1, Final Fantasy XV. This is the perfect game for those joining us from the world of open world games. Final Fantasy XV is one of the newer games of the franchise and represents a big change in direction for the series as a whole. Final Fantasy XV can be highly recommended because it is a complete story. There's a lot to do here. You can take time to explore the world and find all the secret bosses, which are frankly some of the best things in Final Fantasy, or just beeline it through the main game. Tons of the typical tropes and familiar characters exist in this world without relying on the nostalgia that a lot of old players have. It's available on most platforms, making it fairly easy to access. The downsides, on the other hand, there's no turn-based combat, which is a big sore spot for a lot of old players, but it appears that Final Fantasy is moving away from that in general. Combat in general didn't review too well, but it's really not as terrible as everyone makes it out to be. And there can also be pretty long sections of this game that go slowly. Newcomers may not be prepared for a story that takes its time and may become frustrated. However, overall, Final Fantasy XV does appeal to those open world players, which is kind of the thing to do in games nowadays. Number 2, Final Fantasy Tactics. One of the best non-mainline games. This has been re-released over and over and over under multiple titles on multiple platforms. This has been around since the days of Game Boy. This is a turn-based isometric strategy game, and it has loads of familiar characters. It expanded the world of Exvius that we've used in several other Final Fantasy games, so you play this one and you learn more about other games. The story is very good, but combat is the main focus and the highlight here. The combat is fantastic and serves as a great inspiration for many other games. You may have seen in the most recent Nintendo Direct something for Project Triangle Strategy, which was related to Octopath Traveler, and it is a spiritual successor to this game. Downsides? It can be very difficult in sections, especially if you lose a character you've spent time on. This style of game is not the most popular at the moment, so if you've played Disgaea and the like, you've probably already played Final Fantasy Tactics. But it cannot be understated how great the Final Fantasy Tactics name has lived through history, and therefore this is a fantastic introduction to the franchise as a whole. Number 3, Final Fantasy XIV. Currently one of the best MMOs on the market, Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn was birthed from the failings of the original Final Fantasy XIV. I played the beta test of the original Final Fantasy XIV and vowed to never, ever touch this game again. Hundreds of hours into A Realm Reborn and its many expansions, and well, they did a thing to me, guys. Current MMO fans can learn the major classes and races from Final Fantasy, as well as get a flavor for the style of storytelling that these games have. All this without either the turn-based or action-based combat systems used in the mainline games. Plus, this is the only viable and popular Final Fantasy, so it's best enjoyed with friends. Downsides? MMOs take a certain type of player. They may not enjoy the mainline games for the very reason they do enjoy MMOs. The opening of A Realm Reborn is a slog. Luckily, you only have to do it once since you can play all of the classes on one character. But it does take dozens of hours to get to the point where the story starts to be enjoyable, and over 100 hours before you're into the new cinematic stuff. Final Fantasy: A Realm Reborn is great for MMO players to learn about Final Fantasy and then maybe choose to branch off into the typical games. Number 4, Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. The world of mobile gaming has had several cracks at Final Fantasy, but Brave Exvius is the one that has stuck the most. This is an entirely separate game from the Final Fantasy mainline, but still invokes a lot of what Final Fantasy is about. You get introduced to the systems that are common across other games, you get the flavor of the world, and it's all in a free-to-play package. The downsides? Well, it's a mobile game, so it does have its quirks. Namely, you need to be prepared to spend either time, or money, or both. It lacks the gravitas and narrative depth of most of the other mainline games, so if you're looking for that, you may leave here disappointed. But this has been around for a few years and continues to expand, so I expect to see Final Fantasy Brave Exvius last for much longer. Number 5, World of Final Fantasy. It's Pokemon, but like Final Fantasy Pokemon. Honestly, World of Final Fantasy takes me from busting at the seams with laughter to cringing at both the writers and voiceover artists for doing whatever they had to do. World of Final Fantasy was swept under the rug due to its cute anime stylings and non-mainline focus. This game plays like an interactive storybook. However, within the game, you explore multiple Final Fantasy worlds, learn the full depths of the bestiary, and follow the most common of all tropes: the crystals will save humanity. It's a dungeon diver geared towards a younger audience, but it can be enjoyed by adults who can overcome some of the narrative simplicity. Downsides? The cringe, all the cringe. It's written like a Saturday morning cartoon that got a brief synopsis of Final Fantasy, but it leaves a lot of laughs for those who are experienced in the franchise. You don't find this Pokemon style combat anywhere else in the Final Fantasy catalog, so if you're here purely for that, just enjoy this game alone. The best moments are fleeting. It has high highs and low lows as what starts out as unique systems become grindy systems occasionally. World of Final Fantasy is only on PlayStation, at least at the time of writing, but it is something to check out if you have the access to. Number 6, Final Fantasy VII, the King of Kings, consistently rated the best Final Fantasy game of all time. This recently received a remaster that brought it to PC without looking quite as blocky as it used to. If you can get over the very aged visuals, this game has a story that captured a generation. The combat was the peak of turn-based format and really showed off what experienced developers could do in their limited medium. The characters are full of heart and draw you in from the moment you meet them. The world expands as the story does, allowing for those wow moments that only single-player games can really deliver. Downsides? It did not age well. We are visual-driven creatures, and it can be very clunky at times to play. People not experienced in the PlayStation style of artistic backgrounds with janky 3D characters running around on top of them will be pretty confused. It's also overhyped. Look, it's good, but everyone says it's the greatest of all time, so if you go into it and you don't enjoy it, you're made to feel that you won't enjoy any Final Fantasy games, and that's just sad and wrong. Stop gatekeeping Final Fantasy, people. This is only the second mainline game to show up on this list, so you know it's got a reason for being here. Last but not least, number 7, Final Fantasy VII Remake. Alright, this one's gonna get me some hate, but since only 30% of you make it to the end of the video, I might be safe. This is the most recent Final Fantasy game to release, at least at time of writing, and therefore gives us a glimpse of what's to come for the world of Final Fantasy. It's also peak designed by Square Enix. You can play both the action combat as well as the turn-based combat. That means it serves as a great bridge between modern gamers and those who are more comfortable in the past. The story is similar to the original, but consists of its own very unique take. It's visually stunning and has done a lot to further flesh out the depths of the characters you interact with. The original story is told mostly through text, so your brain works to fill in the details. Here, however, the developers have done a lot to show you what it must feel like to live in this world. Downsides? This is part 1, and we have no idea when part 2 is coming, or if there's a part 3. We have nothing to go off of except for rumors. I couldn't recommend this game enough to newcomers to the franchise. It is a great, solid game, but it's not a complete game, so take that with a grain of salt. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a good game. Don't let the haters who dwell on the original tell you otherwise, but for newcomers to the franchise, hopefully they know that this isn't complete. So what do you think of the list? How wrong was I this time? Let me know in the comments down below what you think is the best Final Fantasy game for beginners, newbies to the franchise. This has been Bronze Dad Plays. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy this or any other gaming content. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, you absolute legend, you. And until next time, see ya.